We're not going to be using MoGraph to create a city and generate and place our buildings. We're going to be using pretty basic objects to begin with, which we can then expand upon later. So first we're going to take a look at creating the layout and just how we can use just a couple of different cloner objects to really piece it together. So I want to start by adding in a cube object to the scene, and I'm going to create just a basic size here. We're going to start with 10 meters, and actually we'll go ahead and bring down the Y to 6 meters. So we have 10 by 6 by 10, and we don't need to have any segments or any other variations. So what we can do is hit C on the keyboard, or you can use the make editable command, which is available under functions. What we're going to do is pull up the coordinates and change the Y to 3 meters. So that way it's resting on what would be the ground. And then we're going to switch over to the object axis mode and change that position to 0 for the Y. And that way the pivot point, or our placement pivot, is going to be on the ground as well. That way we don't have objects going underneath or being scaled in that direction. Now we're going to be using the extrusion deformer. So if we open up the MoGraph menu, the same as this top menu here, we're going to add in the extrude and just connect it to the cube. What this is going to do is extrude from every single polygon. So we need to set up a selection tag. We're going to select the cube, switch to the polygon mode, and using the live selection to select the top polygon, go to selection and set the selection. So that is our polygon selection. We can go to cube, switch back to the model mode, and then we can just drag that polygon selection into the polygon selection menu. Now our transformation, we have a from root or per step. I'm going to change this to the per step option. So basically every extrusion step will be treated as an individual clone, which can be modified. The from root option is really for working with splines, which we're not going to be doing right now. So now under the transform tab we have our options, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to line mode for the display so you can see each of the extrusion steps. What we have is a variable scaling setup per extrusion step, and I want to remove that for the moment and set this to 1. So every step is going to be equal sized, and because our floor size or our base size we set to 6 meters, we can also set this one to 6 meters. And under the object mode we can see how many extrusion steps we have. So you could set this to an actual floor height if you wanted to, say around 2 meters, maybe a little bit higher. We're going with 6. We're going to use a little less geometry overall in the end. So we'll go ahead and set our extrusion steps to 10. I also want to create a couple of variations of this object to be cloned. And I do want to note we are going to be modifying this extrusion step amount that we see with an effector. And because we're going to be copying and pasting this over this current object, rather than having to set up all the effectors again, we're going to go ahead and add in right now just a random effector. And under the parameter mode, I'm going to turn off position. And because I had the extrude deformer selected, when I added that effector, it automatically added it to the effectors list. So now I can just copy and paste this object over with the extrusion and the current effector. I'm also going to go ahead and create a null object, which I'm going to hide from the render and from the scene so that we can take the other objects and just drag and drop so that they're hidden while we modify the copy. So we can go in here and select the cube, switch to the polygon mode, and just pull out some of the sides. And if you want to Set that to -10 on the Z. You can really stretch it out a little bit further, but still stay within exact amounts for the moment. And now we can see that extrude update. We can go back, copy, paste. So we'll go ahead and copy the other one. So copy and paste, and then drag this into our null object. And we can pull out another side. And if you want to modify the object axis, you can do that as well, depending on where the clones are going to be showing up. But that might be better to do once we already have a bunch of clones established. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out of the null object, and now we can see our clones. And I'm going to add in our first cloner object. So what we need to do is drag these clones into the cloner object, which is going to start cloning them, grabbing from the list of available clones. If we go to the cloner object, we're going to set this to the grid array. And we have a count. We can set up per axis. We're going to do 1 on the Y, because we're not going to be cloning these upward just to the sides. Our extrusion is going to handle any sort of up and down cloning. And then we can set our count. Well, I'm going to go ahead and set these to 2. And that way we're going to have about 4 buildings per block section. And set this to about 12 meters as our separation between clones. And we are going to have a lot of overlapping within this type of setup. But that's going to make the buildings kind of come together a little bit better. And in the end, it should look pretty cool. Another thing I want to do is take the original cube object, copy and paste it to create a new version of it, and then going to the polygon mode, turning off the cloner for a minute. We can just pull out these other clones and stick them in that null object so we can see the polygons. What I want to do is grab the outer polygons. You could also hit UL on the keyboard to do a loop selection. So U, and then we can see from the list L is the loop, and that'll select the outer edge, or all of the polygons around. I'm going to switch to the scale mode. And we could just scale this object to be a larger cube. And then we can bring these other objects back into the cloner. Because the objects are starting to get a little larger, if we need to increase the distances between our objects, we can. And now we have just one clone set up. And what we're going to do is clone this clone. So this set of cloners will also be cloned. But because we are not rendering instances, the overall clones, or which order they're appearing, can be modified throughout the larger scale cloning. So we're going to add another cloner object. And if you want, you can rename this first one the quad cloner, just because we have basically 4 clones being created. We'll add this to the next cloner object, which we'll set to the grid array, setting 1 on the Y. And now we can increase the amount of clones and create a larger city area. I'm also going to turn off the wireframe and switch to the enhanced OpenGL. Now we are going to see duplicates at the moment of everything because we don't have anything to switch the clones around. We also don't have anything modifying our extrusions yet. So for now I'm just going to start with this, and I'll go ahead and save from this point. So I've gone ahead and saved this as CityGen 001. So now what we want to start with first is modifying the clones and the overall placement, or which clones are showing where, which buildings, so that we don't have that first set of cloners, the quad cloner, just being duplicated over and over and over again identically. So I'm going to add in just another random effector with that main cloner object selected. And under parameter, we're going to turn off position and expand the other option. And what we can do is modify the clone. So now we're going to tell the effector that we want to modify the clones that are within the available clone list. And we do need to switch over the control of the random effector to be within more of a global space or something with a world modifier. So we can switch over to a noise. And I did add the random effector to the wrong clone. We do need to add this to the quad cloner. Because otherwise we're just choosing from this list of one quad cloner. Of course we could set up multiple ones, but we're still going to have the same thing set up. So under the cloner object, we need to go to the effectors list, delete that, go to the quad cloner, and we can drag in that random effector. We can already start to see the changes being made and different clones showing. So we can modify the scales of the random effector. We could switch between all of the different modes available. Keeping in mind, if we have one with animated, we need to set our animation speed to 0 in order to make sure that the clones are not changing if we were to render an animation of this. The UV option is going to be the internal UV coordinates for the set of clones. So a cloner object itself has a UV system. This has nothing to do with textures, just the clones themselves. So I have the scale set to 8 under the turbulence mode, and now what I'm going to do is adjust the minimum value just to modify the clones a little bit more. Could also set up a maximum. Restricting these values too much will remove clones from the list. So it's a good idea to, in this case, use them minimally. Okay, so now we have just different shapes showing, different setups here. And what we're going to go back and do is modify the effector for the extrusion. So I am going to first rename this random effector to quad_random effector so that we know it's affecting the quad cloner. And then our random effector, which is going to affect our extrusion, there's an option under the other to select visibility. Now what this does is basically turns off the clones that are aren't being affected or are being minimally affected. So by turning on the visibility, and then if we also make some changes, do need to set this up kind of the same way. Set it to, say, a noise. We can set our scale. And we can go through the different settings. I'm going to use the noise with the scale of 25, and then what I want to do is take the minimum value and we can increase that in order to raise up our extrusions more, since a lot of the objects are not being extruded. Setting it above 0 usually ensures that everything will at least have one extrusion. And then if we need to group these objects together a little bit more, we can now choose from the quad cloner or the full city clone object, adjusting the size between each of the objects, or the overall size of the clone, also increasing the count, how many clones we have. We'll change the distances. So we can group these a little closer together if we wanted for the quads. And that way we have a little more overlapping. We could also increase the count if we didn't want to have just 4 total clones. If they're close enough and you want a little overlapping so that you have more of a stepping for the buildings, you can just increase that amount. So it's no longer a quad clone in that sense. Now, because the response time for me, primarily because I'm just recording what it is I'm doing, it's starting to slow down. So it's a good idea to set up a couple of different camera angles to be able to move around the scene or look at the shot or the city from different perspectives without having to move the camera around. So I'm going to add a camera. I'm also going to just turn off the clone, the top level cloner object for the full city, just so we have a little quicker of a response. Just move over the other side here, add another camera, and then we can just select and add one more. So now we can just switch between these cameras. Makes it a little easier. So I'm going to make a few adjustments now, just thinning this, or getting rid of some of the larger separations just by increasing the count and decreasing the overall size. It is currently getting a little difficult to decipher the building sides from the tops. So I'm going to set up just a couple of materials, really just 2 materials. We could even just have one for the moment if needed, just to put on the tops of the buildings. So double-clicking within the materials just to create a basic white material, or grayish white. I'm going to call this top, and then drag it onto the cloner object. And now our selection, what we can do, since all of our selections that we created are identical because we cloned or copied and pasted the objects, we can grab that polygon selection and put it in. Because they all have the same name, it'll automatically apply that to any of the clones with that polygon selection tag of that name. So now we have little easier to see shading. And then everything underneath that just has the default surface, which right now is being controlled by the color mode within the cloners. So there is an initial color you can set up. So any object within the cloner list that doesn't have a material will inherit this color. That can also be modified with additional effectors. Now at the moment, each of our objects and each of our buildings only has one extrusion set up. You can set up really as many extrusions as you want and just keep having a list of them. Because we have that original selection tag, we can have the additional extrude carry that over. So let's just go ahead and copy the extrude, paste, so Control-C, Control-V, just to copy and paste it, add it to the list, so now we have a duplicate. And now we can see that just that object within here is being extruded twice. So now we have more variation in the height beyond just the random effector. Although the random effector does still apply. In this case, it might be getting a little too high, so what we can do is reduce the overall extrusion amount to choose from, bring it down to say 4. And now they're being limited. The nice thing about this method, and if we take a look at the wireframe view, every single floor size is equal, which makes this much easier when you want to define textures with a UV map. Because whenever you use an extrusion, whether it's modeling with the extrude tool or using the extrude deformation from MoGraph, it creates a max UV. In other words, the UV map is the extruded polygons, so there would be 4 of them on the cube and 4 new polygons created. Those are all identical for the UV map and just extended to the entire canvas. So if we were to look at the UV map, we wouldn't really see anything except one giant one polygon extending to the full length of the UV. So by using the step mode, we can ensure that every floor size is equal if we want that. Now, if we take a look at our random effector that's controlling the extrusion steps, and we go to the parameters, we do have the ability to modify different options. Actually, we do need to go to the other effector, which I'll go ahead and name Extrude, so there's no confusion. We can go ahead and bring that up in the list here. So we'll see our sorting completed. And then the extrude going to limit our total extrusions. So if we turn it off, we see everything extruded equally. Turn it back on, it subtracts. But still equals steps for everything. If we were to change the extrude setting over to from root, then you won't be able to have that equal amount. And going back to the effector, if we were to use the scale and change the steps scale, what would happen is we would then have uneven step amounts because this will modify per step. And in this case, Z is going to be up and down. So if I go ahead and change this to 3, we can see it is going to modify that overall height of each step, and in this case randomly. So if that is what you're looking to do, that is definitely a possibility. In this case, I'd like to keep that turned off, but to add variation, what we can do is modify some of the other values, and you can see the buildings starting to curve outward or taper down in the way they're looking, depending on whether or not you increase or decrease using negative or positive values. So you can get some pretty interesting looking buildings this way. You can also, and you can see that 1, because it is per step, so it is increasing it with a scale of 1. It's doubling its size every single step, so that's why they look so incredibly large. We can also modify the position and the rotation per step. So right now, with everything set to 50, we can see a lot of erratic behavior. So we can move the steps in a specific direction if needed, or even just add a little bit of randomness this way. And that way the buildings have a little bit of movement, and it will change the way the shading is picked up so that it just doesn't look like a whole bunch of cubes. That can be incredibly useful. For the scale, I'm going to leave that where it is. What I would want to do is modify the overall scale of the object itself. And we can do that with the quad random effector, because this will modify the original object and that original cube rather than the extrusion steps. And another benefit to using the extrusion rather than just scaling a cube on the y-axis is if we want to create any additional extrusions to define the tops of the buildings, those will also be scaled with the entire object, which limits what we can do with the extrusion. So I would like to create just an endpoint of extrusions for the object. And so we're going to create kind of a sequence of extrusion steps. I'm going to do this on, actually we'll go ahead and do it back on the other cube. There's quite a few of those showing. This should show up quite well. We can copy and paste. What I also want to do is add in a null object and add this to the list in between the other extrusion steps, and then rename this topper. The null object itself won't do anything, but it does allow us to separate the extrusion steps in order to create groups of extrusions that can be easily transferred over. Now, we can't move this into the null object without it disappearing. So it really is just there as a visual separator to know what we're working with, especially if we're going to be copying and pasting this over to other objects. So what I want to do is change the extrusion step to 1. I'm going to get rid of the effector, and under transform, I'm going to change the height to 1, which for extrude, Z is going to be up and down, because the original orientation of the object is a little bit different than just other object positions and coordinates. And what I want to do is increase the scale to 1.1. So we are going to have it scale up a little bit. So by adding that Z scale of 1, it is going to raise it up. If you want to have it so there's no taper, and we'll go ahead and just zoom in the camera closer to one of these objects. So we can see it a little bit better. So if I set the Z to 0, it is going to just expand outward and not scale it or move it up. So it's a very harsh cutoff, no taper. We can copy and paste this again, add it to the list, and now set our scale to 1 and the Z to, say, 4. And now we have this kind of topper. We could have, maybe we'll go ahead and set it to 2. And it does look like it's extending farther than I intended. So we can go to the extrusion before that and now change that size to 1.05, which is a very small scale change. And adds a little bit of variation. So now if we want to have the building and that top part maybe sink in a little bit, we could take that last extrusion, copy, paste, add it to the list, turn off any of the movement or the position, and change our scale to 0.95 on the X, Y, and Z. And then if we want to sink it in, we need to have one more. So we can copy and paste the extrusion again, add it to the list, and then keeping our scale the same, set it to a -1. We could sink it in quite a bit. If you did want to scale it down, we could shrink it quite a bit if we wanted to really pick up a highlight, maybe have it uneven, or we can make it go in the other direction. Instead of going negative, we can raise it and get different building toppers that way. If you want to create roofs, a cool thing you can do is just change the scale to 0. Actually, that would work better on one of the other axes. And then we can create kind of rooftops. That's a pretty cool way to set that up. The polygon does still exist. So if you were to bake this object, which all the clones can be baked, provided they're not rendering instances, the individual objects are created. Even if you were rendering instances, the original object that was created with that kind of rooftop, you could just optimize under functions, select optimize in order to merge the points and get rid of that top polygon. We could also scale it up. There's a lot we can really do with it. But let's go ahead and change that to 0.98. Just a slight difference in scale, and negative 0.5. If you need to modify the Phong, maybe bring that down to 15. And that'll remove any excessive shading so it doesn't look like it's too smoothed out. And go ahead and take a look at this from a different camera angle. Now we can start to see those tops showing, and that'll pick up a nice highlight, and of course add a little variation. Now if you do want to have some individual scale changes for the height of that top portion, you can add an effector just to that specific extrusion step. Now what I was talking about before with using a cube and just changing its overall scale with not setting up steps, which is entirely possible, and with the pivot point on the bottom of the object, it will always scale upwards. You won't have anything going down below the ground plane. But if we wanted to create that topper as we just did, the scale that we set for the height of the building also will control that end scale for the extrusion. So by using this, we can really control the individual elements a lot easier. So we go ahead and find that extrude step of 2, and you could just turn any of the extrusions on or off to really see which one does what. And now if we want to add a bit of a scale change, we could add a random effector. Random effectors are really nice because they work very quickly. Shader effectors can slow things down a lot. So in this case, we just want something really kind of random. We don't need to have a shader effector. So what I want to do is just change the position to 0, 0, and then 1, and this adds a little bit of variation. The more variation we want, the higher we can set this amount. Keep in mind it will sometimes subtract because we are setting an overall transformation amount. In order to prevent that from happening and to prevent the scale of or the position of 2 from ever reversing itself, we can set the minimum amount to 0. So at 0%, that will ensure that we never reach a negative value, because we're really setting a maximum range because it is random, and then it'll blend between 0 and 2 in either direction. But by setting that minimum amount under Effector to 0, it will prevent that reverse negative action. And I've just gone ahead and set the transformation space to global, removed the animation speed, set it to 0, and then changed the scale to 25% in order to add more variation in a smaller space. So now if we wanted to have this top extrusion and kind of bevel on every single object, what you can do, so we're going to select from the topper, null object to the end extrusion. We can copy it, and then we can paste this in and drag it down to the next object. Now, depending on the way everything's working with you, in this case it appeared to have worked correctly, but sometimes, and really more if you have different types of polygon selections, things like that, you may have to go into the extrusion steps and modify the polygon selection. Because the interface is the same, you can select all of the extrusions and just drag in the polygon selection, and it will automatically update all of them. Although sometimes you don't want to have a polygon selection. If we wanted to create an overall bevel on the entire object to pick up highlights on the edges, we could use an extrusion step that doesn't have a polygon selection. Every single polygon will be beveled. The only disadvantage at this point is that with our individual extruded steps, every single floor will have a bevel. And you will get some lines showing up. But sometimes that might be what you're looking for. You can create some pretty cool effects that way. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any easy way to create polygon selections based on the extrusion steps. In other words, say changing the material per step, or modifying a selection per step, expanding on a selection. The easiest way is really just to bake out the entire object, make it editable. And then if you do have the polygon selected for that top polygon selection, after you've baked everything, you can create a new selection tag by selecting new polygons. And I am going to just change this Phong shader for these other objects. If you want, you can make it a little bit different. maybe just at the point where it starts to look like it's rounded just a little to add some variation. Might need to increase that a little higher. But what I want to do at this point is go to the quad random effector and set up some additional modifications. We can modify position. Go ahead and start with all of them at 0. And we don't want to go too far out from this because we do want to still have an area where we can have streets. So it really depends on the overall size, the buildings you have, and remembering now that Y is going to be up and down and not like the extrusion where Z is up and down. So we're going to keep that at 0. We can also modify scale a little bit. Take a look from another camera angle. This too, once again, just making sure you don't go too far out. Go ahead and set that to 0.5. Now, because this is modifying our clones, we are going to have, or lose the ability to set the minimum to 0 without changing the clone order. But because our scale is so minimal, we don't need to worry about the objects inverting themselves because the scale is only set to 0.5 at the maximum. If we did have it at 1, there is that possibility that they would invert their overall scale. And there's just one last thing I want to show you before we move on to taking care of the materials and setting up material variations. And that is, right now we have every single instance or clone being created in every space of our quad cloner. So right now it's 2x3, and then that is being cloned. So there's always going to be an object in one of these clone spaces for the count of 2 and 3. Now, just like we modified the extrusion deformer, we can also use random effector to remove sets of clones, remove instances by using the visibility. But an easier way to use less system resources is to add just a null object within the list. So I'm just going to add a null. If we toss that in, we're going to see buildings disappear and areas start to open up more. So that becomes a really easy way to reduce and randomize the clones without having to use any additional effectors, which will use more resources and take up more of the MoGraph cache tag or MoGraph cache file if you're using the cache tag, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. Really, cache tag's more important for animation or any sort of dynamic effects. In this case, we probably wouldn't really need a cache tag unless we decided to send this to network render. We could also add a null object as part of the list for the top level cloner to subtract out. In this case, almost every other instance that is generated, because our mode to produce clones is set to iterate. There's also a cluster mode, which will create all clones in the list. Random mode, which will be able to see random areas removed. A blend mode, which will in this case, you really just see one or the other, but if you had different size clones, it will blend and change the scales to match them up, or shapes, adjusting shapes. And then the sort mode. Sort mode should show the top level clone unless you have an effector set up to modify clone. So just as we modified the clone with that slider for the quad random effector, that would need to be set up for the top level object in order for the sorting mode to show up, because it's setting up the sort order, which clones go where. And because nothing's changing in it at the moment, it is going to show just the top level, which is the quad cloner. So if we switch this around, you'd see only the null objects. So I'm going to change that back right now to random and remove the null, because I don't want to subtract any large areas at the moment. Also, if you want to change the overall look or which objects are going to be grouped together, you can just change the order in which the clones are in the list. And you can really modify things that way. Create an entirely different look just by the order in which the clones are placed in the list. Also, if you're noticing too much overlapping of clones of the same height, one thing you can do is, instead of using a single effector to modify the extrusion steps of every single object, you can set up multiple effectors just by removing the current one from the list and adding a new one to the scene. Or one thing you can do is modify the extrusion steps so that they're different on every single object. That does tend to really help out. So if everyone's just a little bit different with the max amount, you can usually remove a lot of the intersections. And like I said, if needed, you can add in additional effectors to modify the extrusion steps within a different space or a different noise, so that it's not identical. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out as version 4, citygen_004. And I think we're going to pretty much take care of just the overall layout for now.